Hi, Penny Carlson from Intro to Digital Photography. This video is part of a 3-video sequence. If you haven't already done so, you should watch the video on using Adobe Bridge and the video on post-processing your photograph using Adobe Camera Raw. In this video, we're going to take the same picture that we post-process using Adobe Camera Raw, and we're going to post-process it using Photoshop instead. In particular, we'll pay attention to the adjustment tools in Photoshop.
Now we're going to try to do the same thing that we did in Camera Raw using Photoshop. So if you remember, I'll hit the space bar again, bring us down to our smaller icons. And if you remember, I actually already had a photo open in Photoshop. So this is the same picture that we just fixed in Camera Raw. And now we're going to fix it in Photoshop. And you can decide which way to do it you like better. Doing some of the basics I think is easier in Camera Raw, but let's see what we come up with. Photoshop, unlike Camera Raw, does actually change your picture as you work on it. But if you pay attention to one small trick, you can make sure that you can always get back to your original image. Okay, first let's make this image fill the screen, and the best way to do that is just get on the hand tool here, and it'll bring up some boxes up here, and I'll just click full screen. So now I have a nice full screen view to work with. And then what I'm going to do, Photoshop works in layers. That's the whole idea of Photoshop. And layers scare people, but layers really aren't all that difficult once you start to learn to use them. So this is our photo that we brought in, and Photoshop's default is to call it our background layer. Now, if we want to make sure that we can always get back to our original photograph, all we have to do is duplicate that layer and then never work on our original background layer. We can always get back to it. Okay, so to duplicate it, I can either right-click on the PC. I don't know whether you can do that on Mac and hit Duplicate Layer, or I can go up to Layers here and hit Duplicate Layer. Now there's also keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop that you can use. I'm going to stay away from using them at this point because I don't know them for the Mac, and it's probably easier for you guys to follow me if I stick with menus. So I'll hit OK, and now I have a copy of my background layer, and I can do all my work based on that. Okay, I'm actually going to make another copy of this. So I'm going to duplicate the layer again. And I'm going to call this one Auto Adjustments. And we're going to look at some of the automatic adjustments that you can use with Photoshop. Okay. I had you reset your Photoshop workspace to default. And it comes up with this Essentials tool palette. And that's not a bad palette to use when you're working in Photoshop for photos, but there's a better one, and that's the photography format. All right, let me show you a couple other things. We're only going to work with some really basic settings in Photoshop today. We'll get more complicated as we go along. Photoshop is really customizable, and you can change around your workspace. We're not going to work on channels today, but I'm just going to show you and pull it out here. We could move this adjustment layer down here. We can move our layers panel over here. We can resize it if we want. And that's all cool and everything, but sometimes you do stuff like that accidentally and you just want to get it back to the way it was. Alright, well, one way you can get things back to the way it was is to close Photoshop and use the trick we showed you to reset it. Another way to do it while you're in Photoshop is to just go up to your workspace menu up here. You could put it back on Essentials. Now you see we have the Essentials workspace back. But if we want to put it on Photography again, we end up with the adjusted workspace that we just created. So if we want to get that back, we just click this drop-down menu and we put Reset Photography. And now we're back on the same workspace that we started with, and everybody should be working with the same thing. So if at any point you end up messing up your workspace and don't know how to get it back, remember to just go up and reset it up here. The other idea of layers is that you work on layer by actually selecting that layer. And you can see that this layer is highlighted right now. So any changes that we're making now are happening only to the highlighted layer. All right, so I want to show you some of the automatic adjustments that you can use. So if you don't know much about Photoshop, you just want to see whether Photoshop will fix your picture a little bit, you can use these auto adjustments. You have auto tone, and we got a little bit of a change here. I usually get a more dramatic change than that. We have auto contrast. We could do these on separate layers if we wanted to. And auto color. All right, I really didn't get much of a change here, and I certainly didn't lighten up my image. And we can just look, we can take that off, and when we take that little eye off, we're making that layer invisible. So you can see the color changes just a little bit when I put that on. Maybe got a little bit bluer, but I didn't get much of a change at all. So I'm going to work on this background layer. I've got this selected, I've got this layer off. So this layer is not visible at this point in time. I'm leaving it there in case I want to do something with it later, or in case we decide that that's a better look for a photograph. So you can experiment with different things on different layers and then get rid of the layers that you don't want. That's another great thing about Photoshop. So what we're going to do today is just use these adjustment layers. We're going to kind of stay away from using tools. I guess the one thing I could show you is how to crop. This picture doesn't need cropping, but here's our crop tool. So we can select that if we wanted to crop. And again, we have some ratio presets up here. And if we want the ratio to stay the same as the original photo, you just click this. And then we can resize our screen. We can move our picture around and crop it if we want. I don't want to crop this picture. If I wanted to crop it, I'd hit that arrow. I don't, so I'm going to hit the undo. I'm going to go back to the little hand sign because that's a good tool to be on. You won't mess anything up when you're on that. It'll just move your picture. And when I go back to that, it asks me if I want to crop the image. I'm going to put don't crop. All right, so these are your adjustment layers, and they'll do similar things to what we did in Camera Raw. Now, if you're going to work in Photoshop CS2, you really can do most of this exercise in CS2, but you're not going to have this palette up here that gives you your adjustment layers. The adjustment layers are still there. You're just going to have to go to this layer on the bottom and see the little circle there. Left click on that and your adjustment layers will come up that way. I'm going to start out here with levels. You notice a lot of these have an auto setting. So let's click the auto there. It didn't do that much, maybe brightened it just a touch. When I look at the histogram here, I see that I'm getting a lot of darkness. Well, it took a while, we just got a little bit more brightness there. I'm getting some clipping with my shadows. Highlights I don't want to change too much. I've got my highlights all the way over to the right, so you can see if we move this slider over, we start to lose detail in the sky. We don't want to do that. What the histogram tells you is the information that's in various parts of the photo. So the darkest part, the lightest part, and the mid-range. You see, we don't have much information in the mid-range. It's the sunset. We've got a fairly bright sky, and we've got a dark, underexposed landscape. Now we can fix this a little bit by just moving this slider over a bit to the left. And that looks a little bit better. Maybe we've lost some of the detail in the sky though. And let's put that back. Right now I'm going to take that off because we're going to also look at what we could do with another one of our adjustments. I'm going to now use curves. Curves tend to scare people, but they're really not that hard to use. Okay, so we'll try the auto with the curves. I just brightened it a little bit. I don't like that. So I can hit that little undo key right here. It brings it back. Okay, so with curves, if we click on a spot in the curve, we're setting an anchor. It's often good to do that in the middle. And then we can kind of fool around. If we move this to the right, we're darkening our shadows. If we move it to the left, we're lightening them. So that's kind of what we want to do. We want to fool with these. I don't want to lose too much detail over in there. I was kind of watching this segment. So we brought a lot more detail into our shadows. And see what we can do up here. I probably don't want to do too much here, but I think that looks a little bit better. Take our on, off, looks quite a lot better. Take it over to the side. Okay, curves off, curves on. What happens if we add the levels to it? Oh, that doesn't look so good, but let's look at our levels again. So now that we've got the curves on, let's try the auto level again. So let's click on this circle, hit auto. Now I end up doing kind of a better job, at least than it was before. Again, let's look at it on. Now it's off, on, off. Okay, well now I think it's looking a bit better with it on, so let's leave it there. Okay, so we brightened up our picture quite a bit. We could also try fooling with the exposure. So here's our exposure. So maybe now I want to try fooling with the brightness. I've got all these layers highlighted because I want it to impact all of them. Click on my brightness contrasts, and I'm going to try the auto again. See what I get. Well, I think that overdid it a bit. I'm going to dial it back. Maybe I want a little bit more with the brightness. Contrasting again, you can fool with the sliders, take them all the way one way, all the way the other way. And there's no magic formula for figuring out what's right. It's really what looks best to you. Okay, so now again we can try, it's on now, try it off, on, off, on. Okay, so subtle. Get over here and just get a full view. Do I like it or not like it? All right, so the next thing we want to do, remember we brought up our saturation a bit, and there's two ways we can do that. There's a hue saturation slider, but I like the vibrant slider better, and saturation's also on that. Okay, so I'm going to bring that up. Well, let's fool around with it just like we did with our Camera Raw. I'm going to put this all the way over to the right and see what happens. And it did bring the colors up a bit, but not the same way it did in Camera Raw. So the settings aren't exactly the same. And again, you can see which one works best. It does make it almost black and white when we bring it all the way down. So let's see, I'm going to bring this up a bit. We can look at our saturation, and you see that really brings it to a garish kind of look. So let's dial that back quite a bit. Maybe just bump it up a little bit. That looks pretty good to me. Hit our arrow. And again, we could come back and adjust this if we wanted to at a later point in time, just like we did with the levels. I'll show you what happens now if we put this automatic adjustment on. And you know what? That's pretty much taking it back to our original picture. We hadn't made all the adjustments when we'd done that. So I'm going to get rid of that layer. And I do that by just dragging it down into that trash can. Okay, so this is looking pretty cool. Now what I want to do is sharpen it. Okay, we did that in Camera Raw. We're going to do it here. I'm going to show you two different techniques you can use to sharpen it. So I'm going to duplicate the layer once, and I'm going to call this one Sharpen. I'm going to duplicate the layer again, and I'm going to call this one High Pass Filter. Hit OK. We're all set. All right, I'm going to also change the order of these layers. So I'm going to put this one down here. Okay, and you can do that. I've got the sharpen layer highlighted, so that's the layer we're working on. Now, I should turn this off, but I'm not going to right now, just to show you what happens if I don't. And I'm going to go up to Filter. That's where our sharpening tools are. We'll look at Sharpen. And there's a few different sharpening tools you can use, but the unsharp mask will actually give you the most control. And it might seem counterintuitive, you use an unsharp mask. That's actually your sharpening tool. Okay, so I'm bringing it up, and let's see what happens if we move this all the way over to the right. I've got the preview selected, turn it on, turn it off. And it doesn't look like anything's happening. So why is that? Well, I'll tell you why it is. It's because this high pass filter that we haven't done anything to yet is the visible layer because it's on top of the sharpen mask. So let me cancel this. All right, and take this off. Now also it's always a good idea when you're sharpening to kind of zoom in on your picture so you can see when you're starting to get some changes that might not look so good. So there's a couple ways you can zoom in. You hit the zoom tool and make sure it's on plus here. If you want to zoom out, you make sure it's on minus. Or you can just hit Control plus if you're using a PC. I think it's Command plus if you're using a Mac. I might get the Mac stuff wrong. Sorry about that. So just use the menu right now. And if I want to move it around, I go back to my hand tool. I kind of want to be able to see these flowers in here and see what's happening over here. Okay, so now let's go back to our filter again. Sharpen, unsharp mask. Usually best leaving your radius about 1, maybe 1.5 at the most. Now let's see what happens as we go all the way out. And see how we did get a pretty dramatic change. Well, that's probably too much. Let's dial it back a bit to maybe around here. I'll go up to around 115. That looks pretty good. We're not really getting distortion, but we've sharpened our picture quite a bit. Click OK. And if we want to see what it looks like, we can just click on our fill screen icon up here, and there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to use a different sharpening technique. I really like sharpening using this high pass filter. Again, I'm going to zoom in. Let's take this off because we don't want to see the effects of the sharpened picture. We want to see what's going to happen if we do it with the high pass filter. And to use the high pass filter, we go up into here, filters again, under other, and then high pass. You want to set your radius. There's a few different ways you can sharpen using the high pass filter. I'm going to set it to 4.5 here. If you use this method, 4.5 is probably a good radius to set it to. Now, you're saying this looks like a gray blob, and it really does. But what we're going to use now are blending modes. And when you're using the high pass filter, we'll learn a little more about blending modes later. You want to either use overlay, soft light, or hard light. So hard light will give you the sharpest picture, soft light a little more diffuse, and overlay somewhere in the middle. I usually tend to use overlay. And again, we can take this on, take it off, put it on, and watch right in here how it sharpens a bit. Off, on. Notice how this stuff is sharpening a bit. Okay, we can compare our high pass filter. Okay, take it off, use our sharpening mask. Okay, take that off, use our high pass filter. And I like the way the high pass filter sharpens it a little bit better than the unsharp mask. And do fill screen so we go back to our original picture. And then if we want to look at it again this way, off, on. See, this gets a little more defined in here. Off, and we can put our sharpening mask on. Okay, again, I'm going to get rid of that one and use that one. So now we've fixed our photo using Photoshop. We can save it and compare it to the photo we fixed using the Camera Raw. One of your assignments is to fix one of your photos using both of these techniques, and I'm gonna have you put the Photoshop version in the Dropbox on eCollege so I can see that you've learned to use all these layers. Now if you want to neaten it up a little bit, you could get rid of the layers that you're not using. Like if I want to get rid of that on Sharp Mask, you just throw it into the trash bin. Or I could leave it there. If I want to go back, undo delete. Because that would let me come back and maybe change it. Maybe I print that photo out. I'm not sure that I like it. I want to try printing it and using the unsharp mask instead of the high pass filter. And I can do that by just making the high pass not visible and making the sharp invisible. So let's put the high pass back on and let's save it as a Photoshop document. And this is what you're going to need to put in the Dropbox that you give to me on Sakai. So we'll do File, Save As, and we can leave the name the same and want to make sure it's listed as this PSD or Photoshop document, and you want to make sure that this layers box is checked. So let's click Save. Okay. We could flatten this image. If we like the way it looks, we want to take up less space on our computer. I usually save one copy of every document I work with in Photoshop as a layered document, PSD. And if you save it as a JPEG, it's going to automatically flatten it. Your assignment is to fix one of your photos using both Camera Raw and Photoshop. Although I'm going to want to get a copy of the Photoshop document, you're going to post the others to the Flickr assignment group. So in order to do that, you're going to need to save this file as a JPEG. So you do File, Save As, and change that to JPEG. You want to use this version, the normal JPEG. That's the most widely supported. That's going to automatically get rid of your layers. So I'll click Save. I've done this before, so yes, I do want to replace it. Okay, now when this little dialog box comes up, you want to either save it as baseline standard or baseline optimized. The progressive was actually made for older computers when we didn't have such high-speed internet, because it would load in 3 progressive scans. So it appeared to load a little bit faster, though the full quality didn't load until all 3 scans were completed. The baseline optimized actually optimizes the color for the web, and you get a slightly smaller file size. So I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to close out Photoshop. It's going to take a little time to save the shots, and I'll close it when I'm done. All right, so let's go back to Bridge, and we can look at the different photos that we've just done. All right, I named them very similar names so they'd stay next to each other in Bridge. It makes it a little easier to look at them. Here are the photos that we've worked on. The original, the Camera Raw document, the Photoshop, and then the Photoshop saved as a JPEG. So they're going to look exactly the same. So I've highlighted those 4 photos, and when I hit the space key, it'll just cycle through those 4 photos. Okay, so I'll hit space. There's our original. If I hit the right key, there's our Camera Raw. That looks pretty good. There's our one that we fixed in Photoshop. So I actually like the Camera Raw one a lot better. I like the way the Camera Raw corrected for some of the lens distortions. You can see the difference. It depends on the photo. Sometimes I've fixed them both ways, and the Photoshop one has ended up being better. I think for your basic editing, if you don't have Adobe Lightroom, again, we'll cycle through them again. If you don't have Adobe Lightroom or Apple Aperture, which will basically do the same things as Camera Raw, I would tend to do my basic work in Camera Raw and then open the Camera Raw photo with the adjustments that I'd made in Photoshop. So for example, you could do everything but your sharpening in Camera Raw and then just go through and do that high pass filter sharpening, which I like, using Adobe Photoshop. With Photoshop, you're definitely going to learn by doing. So I'm probably going to give you an assignment every week as we work with Photoshop, but I'll lay off the quizzes a bit because I think you're going to learn Photoshop by actually following through and correcting your photos. One way you might want to do it is to be watching the video on your phone or another device while you work on your photos in Photoshop.